Leadership is about the led, not the leader. The leader should always be thinking about the men and women charged under his or her care and what is best for them, what will cause them to be collectively successful, what brings them to their highest potential.
Are you doing that for the purpose of being first, or are you doing that for the purpose of causing a collective achievement? The ultimate definition of leadership, the willingness of others to follow you. Until that happens, you're not a leader.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm honored to have General Vince Brooks as a guest on the program. General Brooks is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He served in 3 wars and served simultaneously as Commander of the United States Forces Korea, the U.S. South Korea Combined Forces Command, and United Nations Command, overseeing approximately 650,000 personnel. Additionally, he was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was awarded multiple medals, including the Army Distinguished Service Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters and a Bronze Star. After retiring from the Army, he has served on the board of directors of multiple corporations. General Brooks, welcome to the Science of Leadership. Thank you for being here, sir, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Collins. Honored to be with you.
The last time that we talked, you shared with me, as a leader, you really value this idea of servant leadership. And, since 1977, when Robert Greenleaf first wrote about servant leadership, it's really become a term that a lot of people have talked about and written about. But I'm interested to know what that term means to you.
It's very interesting. So the concept has been out there for a long time. Certainly, as you described it, even longer, depending on what your source of inspiration is.
Sure.
And for me, it's all about the example that one sets, and the basic premise that leadership is about the led, not the leader. Mm-hmm. And so if that's to be true, then the leader should always be thinking about the men and women charged under his or her care and what is best for them, what will cause them to be collectively successful, what brings them to their highest potential, and less about themselves. Does it make me look good? I have to be first. All these other sorts of things that can be distorted and are not examples of servant leadership. I alluded to, depends on what your origin is in terms of where you draw inspiration. For me, there's a spiritual dimension to this also, is
Sure.
Being a Christian. I mean, this is the teachings of Christ, that the last among you shall be first and the first shall be last. And so this idea of subordinating your own self-interest for the collective interest is an old example of what leadership should be.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is interesting to me that people herald Robert Greenleaf and his little pamphlet from 1977 as the sort of origin of servant leadership. But I come from the same perspective as you do, and that it's at least a couple thousand years old. So, the last time that I talked to you, you shared with me a story, and I'm hoping you would recount that here for our listeners too. But when you were a 1-star in Iraq, and this event that occurred at the dining hall, and having talked with 51 4-stars for the sake of my project and book, that story became, at the moment I heard it, actually became the example of servant leadership to me, and I just still I love it. And so, if you would, I'd be delighted if you'd recount that event and all that transpired.
Yeah, thanks for asking. When you interview 51 4-star generals, all of them have stories like this. So I'm sure that I'm not unique in this, but it is part of my experience and my journey, and I learned an awful lot from it. But just to set the scene a little bit, I was the deputy commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division, which served as the headquarters of Multinational Division Baghdad. So it was the main force in the height of the surge, as it's now called, in 2006 to 2008. And we were there for almost that whole period. So middle of 2006 until the beginning of 2008, a very pivotal time. We'd been through a lot of extraordinarily difficult fighting, and also trying to stabilize the environment around us, protecting the population, doing things that are now viewed as just commonplace counterinsurgency, but was cutting edge in terms of the practice of it on such a widespread scale in the summer of 2007. And, in this particular case, things had actually turned for the better. Sometimes in combat, you can't tell if you're winning or losing, and winning feels really bad. By the way, it's not a comfortable feeling because of the price that's paid by people that you're leading and that you're caring for. And we paid a large price up to that point in time. But finally, things began to tip in the positive direction by the fall of 2007. And by now, it's the beginning of October. And so it had been relatively quiet. And one evening I was along with my protection team, my aide, and a few others that I tend to move with my driver. That was kind of my squad that I would hang out with day to day. We were finally getting a chance to eat. I was supposed to go to a meeting with the next higher operational commander, General Ray Odierno at the time. And it was our chance, for the 1st Cavalry Division, Multinational Division Baghdad, to provide an update, just us, with our senior commanding general. So my boss, General Joe Phil, and my colleague, General John Campbell, we're all going to head up there to do that. Well, I was at dinner with my troops, with my team, and was looking forward to eating some chocolate cheesecake. So we finally had chocolate cheesecake back in the dining facility, and I enjoyed that quite a bit at the time. And I'd taken my first bite, and then I heard the sirens. There's a specific alarm for when there's incoming artillery fire or missile fire. Incoming. Then this klaxon horn goes off, and it just keeps on going as long as there's missiles detected in the air.
We could hear them impacting in different parts of the camp. And honestly, that was the first time we'd been through that. So become a little bit numb to the sound of it. And so I continued eating my cheesecake. And then there was, a pause. And then the alarm is still going. And then a very loud blast right outside of the dining facility, and it's during meal hour. The sun has gone down, so it's dark. Troops are still in line to come in. And, this explosion happens right outside. And so your first reaction when that occurs is, okay, now you're going to have to take cover. You got to take it seriously. And so people are trying to orient themselves, figure out what to do next. It did not hit the dining facility. It was just outside of the dining facility. And a few moments later, we start hearing, medic. People are yelling for medic. And in through the dining facility doors, someone's carrying someone in who's now been severely wounded and is bleeding out onto the dining room floor, essentially, to describe it that way. And that tells us we now have to go into action. And so, as I probably was the senior officer in the dining facility at that point in time, just happened to be in there at that time. The moment felt like that scene from Saving Private Ryan. I always describe it in those terms, where the captain and his troops have assaulted the beach. They're pinned down pretty heavily. They're taking casualties left and right. Some of them are still advancing, but there's confusion, and an explosion nearby dazes the leader.
Yeah.
And he's trying to just get himself oriented. But his troops are looking to him for leadership, regardless of the circumstance that he's in at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see them mouthing, "What do we do now, sir?"
Right.
And it's that moment where the leader has to get reoriented and begin to lead, not just to survive. And so I felt like that. And I wasn't physically dazed like the character in the movie was, but we're in a confusing circumstance, and people are looking at the senior officer in the dining facility. "What do we do now, sir?" is the unspoken look that they gave me.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that people are starting to come in, it's now start going into action. So we start clearing off tables to get people laid out. More and more are starting to come through the door, and it's clear we have a mass casualty event. So we have at least 5 or 6 who are now wounded and bleeding. One particular person came in, and I asked him, "Are you doing okay? What's up?" He says, "I can't breathe very well." And so we checked him and saw he had some blood seepage from underneath of his arm. Mm-hmm. And so I determined that the best thing to do at that point in time is to move to where the aid station was, to where the medical facilities were located on the camp. And I had a vehicle, so knowing that it was going to take a while to get ambulances there, and then it would be multiple turns of ambulances, I took it upon myself to gather me, my driver, my aide, my security officer, and this warrant officer who had been wounded and was having difficulty breathing, and drive straight to the dispensary and warn them that we had a mass casualty and to get things moving. So it was to try to trigger the support. Things were in hand in the dining facility, even though more and more people were coming in. The poor workers in there were a bit in shock because all these bleeding people are coming in now, and blood is all over the floor, over the tables. And so we took this good warrant officer to the clinic to get treatment started on him, and then within a matter of minutes, people started to flow in, which was good news. Good news that the response is beginning to unfold. You hate to see that happen, but that's what it's there for.
Yeah.
And within a few minutes, it's pretty clear that the medical staff is overwhelmed, as it should be. I can't remember the total number of tables that were available inside of the aid station, but it was somewhere no more than 10 and probably no less than 3 or 4. So somewhere inside of there, and we've got at least 20 casualties coming in. Some of them have traumatic amputations of limbs. Some of them, like this one that I carried, have puncture wounds and are unable to breathe because they have a sucking chest wound, as we describe it. Mm-hmm. Others are involved in other circumstances. And you, as a cardiologist, you know that when the clock is running, when you have an episode that's unfolding, and the clock was running on several people, some of them were in really bad shape. They're crying out. Some of them were silent. I happened to be nearby a table where one young man was brought in. He looked like he was in perfect condition, and yet he was unconscious. And so I stayed with the team that was working on him. It was one medical officer, several more junior medical assistants of various sorts, nurses, technicians, et cetera, who were in there trying to figure out where's the problem? And, they're cutting off clothing, as you well can appreciate, to try to find what is the problem for this particular individual. And his name sticks with me still, Sam Pearson. And Sam had 2 puncture wounds on his back, going into his thorax. Mm-hmm. And he was bleeding inside, and we couldn't see it. He looked perfect otherwise. And, we're yelling, "Come on, Sam, stay with us. And the team is trying to cheer him on, and I'm trying to encourage those who are actually trying to do medical work. Mm-hmm. And at that point, you kind of think to yourself, all right, I'm the leader in here. What's my job? What should I be doing? But really, in that circumstance, the leaders are the medical officers. And while they were significantly more junior in grade than I was, the most senior one was a major in there at the time. Mm-hmm. That major's in charge. And the sergeant beside that major was a head nurse, and that specialist over here, who's a technician, they're in charge. Mm-hmm. And so my determination was, how can I help them best? And it was either handing them materials that they were working on, moving something out of the way if they had a syringe that was down near their feet, pushing it out of the way so they wouldn't possibly step on it or injure themselves, mm-hmm. cleaning up blood, or even just holding an IV bag, which I spent quite a bit of time trying to do for Sam Pearson while cheering him on, trying to help mm-hmm. him. That's what I determined was the best role of leadership I could fulfill at the time. They were doing critically important work. They had the competence that I did not have. I recognized that. I'd been taught first aid, et cetera, and combat casualty care, but they're the teachers. And so the best thing that I could do at that point is help them. When it came time, it was probably 10, 15 minutes for the first medical evacuation helicopters to fly in. We could hear them arriving from outside the camp, and the medical officers prioritized Sam Pearson because he He'd been unconscious. We weren't able to resuscitate him, and then we got a pulse. And so he had the priority to be moved as quickly as possible to fly from the camp downtown to Baghdad's hospital, where our trauma surgeons and others were there with much better resources to give him a chance to live. And so what could I do then? Carry the litter is what I can do. Take a position on the litter. It's 4 people, getting him hoisted onto the litter, carrying the litter outside of the building and across the helipad as the helicopter's landing and blowing dust everywhere at night, doing it safely, helping him be loaded onto the aircraft, and then, seeing that aircraft take off and praying that he's going to have a chance, He didn't make it when it was all said and done. The 30 people were wounded and 2 were killed that night. And unfortunately, Sam Pearson was one of them.
General Brooks, that's just a profound, story generally, but also with regard to the example of servant leadership, and to give listeners some idea of what it means for a 1-star to step into the role of becoming an IV stand or hauling a litter. Typically in the Army, what would a 1-star, the responsibility of personnel for a 1-star general be?
Yeah, so a 1-star general who is a deputy commanding general of the division is the assistant to, there are 2 of us, but we were assistants to the actual commanding general, who was a 2-star general. And the command at the time was very large. It's one of the largest combat formations we've ever fielded, because we had multiple units coming in from the United States, surging to be an increased presence where we needed them the most. And so at that time, we probably had about 14,000 or so troops. And some portion of my boss's responsibilities were my responsibilities in support of my commanding general. And so some of the units were, I would be a primary overseer of certain units, for example, and my other colleague, General John Campbell, would be focused on other units, and particularly maneuvering and supporting units. So my role is as the deputy commanding general for support. And so I focused on aviation units, logistics units, artillery units, signal units, these types of units, engineers, civil affairs, these ones who can help to shape the environment within which we're conducting work, while my colleague focused on the assaulting units who were doing specific work. We both overlapped in terms of touching them, because the units are the same. The areas that they were working in, they had both fighting and reconstructing missions simultaneously. But the 2 of us tended to divide the fighting and the reconstructing side. I had the reconstructing side, as well as the readiness of the formation. So that was what my scope was normally. And but when something happens, when you're a leader and you're present, then your leadership becomes much more narrow, much more refined than that. And it's for the here and the now. It's for the people who are in immediate need of support, which is a form of leadership, of resources, which is a form of leadership, of guidance and direction, which is a form of leadership, of inspiration, which is a form of leadership. They need all of these things at the same time. They need an example of courage. This is one of the things that leaders are all supposed to do, especially military leaders. You're expected to be courageous. The reality, as your book definitely points out, is you're a human being also. And you're scared as hell if something's happening to you too, just like it's happening to everyone else. So the reality of your mortality does tend to show up, but leaders have to rise above that and try to, once again, as a servant, think about what do those who are being led, what do they need right now? And they need courage. Courage is contagious.
And I would even say servant leadership is contagious. That as we role model that, then people see that's how General Brooks is operating. I should operate in the same manner.
That is contagious. And it's a great point. As time went on and more people flowed into that aid station, more and more leaders also came in. Some of the leaders were wounded, but there were others who were coming to find out what just happened to my troops. We just heard about this strike that happened at the dining facility. And they're lieutenant colonels. They're people who are senior, once again, to everyone in the clinic. And they saw what I was doing. I wasn't trying to do it to get attention. I was doing it to try to help. But before you know it, fewer and fewer of the medical personnel were doing anything other than providing medical care, because there were more and more leaders who were in there holding hands of somebody, providing support, being a standing IV tree, whatever they had to be. They were doing the same thing that I was doing. And whether they were following my example or just following their own sense of what leadership was required at the time, I couldn't say, but I wasn't the only one doing it when it was all said and done.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for sharing that. There was the initial time that you told me that story, and I captured it, and then I had to go through and analyze every transcript. And so I've read those transcripts over and over and over. And every time that I read that, it moved me. So thank you for that.
And I just want to say the names once again is Samuel Pearson.
Yes, sir.
And the other one was Lillian Clemens. I remember them both.
Yes, sir.
Don't forget.
And that actually gets to a point about leadership I think that's really important, is caring about the folks that we lead. Last week I talked with Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and he followed the example of General Marty Dempsey with regards to having this box with these cards in it for every single soldier that died while he was in command. And it's the same sort of thing, that the leader cares enough to know and to remember that. So
I have the bulletins from every one of the memorials that I went to during that time. There are 249 of them, and they're literally right behind me.
Yeah. Well, so moving beyond sort of defining and having a great example of what servant leadership looks like. Before, when we talked, and I think it was spontaneous in the moment, because we talked about the irony that you're a soldier, and the sailors came up with this idea, but it was, think about the wake. You mentioned that, and so what did you mean when you said that when we talked before?
I really appreciate that you captured that, and you have a visual on the side of the book that really lays it out really, really well. But of course, as an infantry soldier myself, I'm going to claim we're the ones who have to swim across lakes. Our sailor friends are wise enough to get on a platform to cross water bodies. But so the story behind this really is, while I was a junior officer, so I'm fairly new in actual Army leadership. I had plenty of leadership experiences up to that point, but in actual leading of soldiers, I was probably a year and a half or so out of West Point at that point in time. I had idolized my boss, my battalion commander. It's one of the reasons why I went to that unit, was to go with him. And as time went on, I began to realize he was a human being, and that humanity, that fallibility, was initially a shock to me. I thought this guy was perfect, and he's not perfect. He's human.
Sure.
And so, coming to grips with the reality that leaders are human and are fallible, that they have personalities, they have foibles, they have expertise, they have examples that they set, they have all the above, but they're total package. And that's more than the image that might be created by a subordinate initially. So I was a subordinate who was learning the reality of that. And I realized that for the longest time, before I got involved in military activities at West Point, when I was in high school, when I was on team sports in junior high school, what have you, I always felt like the task was to strive for excellence and be the first one to the other side. To lead the way, to be the best. And whatever you encountered, whether it was obstacles or things that were in your way, that was your challenge to overcome those, to stay the best and to stay out in front. Right. And it was at that time when I realized the humanity and foibles and fallibility of of leaders that I realized that it's not about being the first one to the other side. That's not what's most important. And if you'll pause and look behind you, you will find that you're actually creating a wake. The further in you go, the more of a wake you create behind you. Mm-hmm. And if you have been the kind of leader that people want to follow, which to me is the ultimate definition of leadership, mm-hmm. That's the ability and the willingness of others to follow you. Until that happens, you're not a leader. All right. But once you're being followed, then there are people who are actually in your wake, who are following behind you and creating their own wakes, to be sure, but they're following behind you, and your focus should be more on those in your wake than being the first to the other side. You might end up being the first to the other side, but what did you bring behind you? What was the breadth of your wake? How many people are like you or better than you because of the impact you had on them as a leader? In other words, it's your legacy that becomes the most important.
That's the word I was thinking of. Yeah, legacy.
Not your achievement. That's not the real legacy. The legacy is the effect on those led by you, and where they end up and where they arrive and how big their wakes are. And, I've learned over time, I don't know what caused that to come into my head, but that was the metaphorical image that came into my mind at the time. And it stuck with me. And that has been my guidepost since then. What about the people behind you? And at this stage, being retired after many, many years of service, I think about the people who are either still serving or went a little bit longer than I did after I retired, that I had the privilege of having in my wake at a point in time. And I am incredibly proud of that. It's far more fulfilling than any achievement that I have. Without a doubt, it's to see the success of people who are in that wake.
Absolutely. That people have studied this idea of what's called generativity, where over a course of people's lives, most people will get to a point where it's about giving back. It's about helping the next generation. It's about helping other people do great things. And I think that those of us inclined toward leadership and trying our best to be the best leaders we can arrive at that generativity earlier, from what I can tell. I think most people, clearly not all, given what we see in society, but most people by a certain point in their lives begin to come around to that. I think we're sort of designed that way, perhaps, by human nature. But among the ones that I've seen who really are the kind of people that you want to swim behind, that comes to them earlier, it seems to me. And, it's in following your metaphor in the book, I talk about those of us who've done triathlons, and this gets to the reality of you never know how wide or how far reaching your wake is, in that in a wave start in a triathlon, everybody's into the water. It's a melee. People are hitting, punching, kicking. I've broken my toe before on somebody's face when I was, getting started in a swim, and all sorts of things, and people drown and whatever. But there's always somebody who was like, the Olympian or whatever in swimming, and who's out in front, right? And they're way out there, and they start breaking the water and removing the debris and so forth, and everybody kind of entrains into their wake and ends up following. There may be a buoy out there a mile away, and that first person is going to the buoy, but then people end up entraining in that wake and following the person in front of him who's following the person out in the lead so far back that the person in the back is just following this set of feet right in front of them, ultimately following that leader. But it's that long distance, that wake that goes so far back, so that we never can know fully what our leadership legacy is. And that gets to, I think, gets to your point of the breadth of the wake that we have behind us?
It's interesting because there will be people in your wake who are, in fact, drafting behind you and seek to overtake you. And that's okay. That's okay. My view is I want everyone that I'm leading to be better than I was.
Sure.
Doesn't matter how good I am, you should be better. And so there will be some who are doing that. But the big difference is when you're doing this as a leader, you're doing it for the purpose of a collective movement toward the buoy, toward the far side, however you want to use the metaphor. You're trying to move everyone to that, as opposed to when you're individually competing, which had been my mistake up to that point in time.
Sure.
You don't want anyone else to be in front of you. You don't want to be the one who's drafting. You want to lead because you're first, which is different than leading because you're followed. And so I think both of those have relevance for people to think about it and maybe reflect on it in the abstract on which are you doing as a leader.
Yeah.
You want to be out there, you create a wake when you're the first one, but are you doing that for the purpose of being first, or are you doing that for the purpose of causing a collective achievement? And that will become your difference.
Yeah. Well, Jim Brooks, it's clear that servant leadership is really important to you, and if we look at the literature, study after study has shown that servant leadership improves teamwork, collegiality, effectiveness with regard to accomplishment of tasks. People often are more creative and teams are more successful. So the question I think that I have is, how do we become better servant leaders? And by that, I mean, how do we make it not about us and our achievement, but about, as you like to say, the lead? How do we do that? Are there steps? Or is there some process, something?
Well, some of this is maturation in leadership. As one becomes more mature about leadership, you tend to be able to have a broader view about what leadership really is. And that some of that's iterative from leadership experiences, but it's also a matter of reflection and examination as you look at other examples and compare it to your own. First step is to look for the examples of people who others want to follow. What is it about them that causes others to want to follow them? And you might have to evaluate. You might get it wrong. You say, "Oh, well, this person's the best athlete. That's easily it. This person's the best looking. That's easily it. The person's the smartest. That's easily it." It can be these things that are superficial, and they may be contributors, but you can always find that there's a counter to that. This person isn't the best looking, and yet people want to follow him or her. This person isn't the most fit, and yet people want to follow him or her. Something else must be in play that both of them have that causes them to want to be followed. So the first thing is examine good examples of leadership. The second step is to get a grip on yourself. To me, the first person that has to be led is yourself. You need to learn how to lead yourself. And what is it that motivates you to lead? Is it because I want to be in charge? That's why I like to lead. I like being in charge. I like being at the top. I want to be the fill in the blank, but the is capitalized.
Right.
And so whatever it is that you're striving for, that is a motivation, but is it the right motivation? You might want to get a grip on yourself. This idea of servant leadership, and I think you'll find that as a common theme throughout the 51 generals and admirals that you interviewed. It's really remarkable how a system can produce that over and over again. And it is so contrary to the stereotypical four-star general or admiral.
Yes, sir.
Why is that? Why is there such a gap in understanding between what real senior leadership looks like and what the image of senior leadership is to others who examine it or put it in movies or whatever the case? It's not about being the loudest, the most brash, the flashiest. That's not what it's about.
Right.
It's about creating an inspiration for people to want to go where you are taking them.
Yeah.
Even if it means to their death. It's military leadership to me is the ultimate in leadership. But it could also be about going through a degree of risk making a large merger or an acquisition that others said that's probably not going to work, but the leader says it can work because of who we are and what we can accomplish. So this sense of self-reflection that peels back the layers of the proverbial onion on what is the core of why you are seeking to lead. What is that? And come to grips with it. Get in balance about it and become mature about it. I guess the last one is the willingness to learn is part of the continuous steps on becoming an excellent leader. You never have it completely right. You could have led better on this case or that case. And what you did yesterday is not good enough for tomorrow. Several of your generals and admirals say that.
Yes, sir.
You must continuously learn about leadership and about your own leadership. That means being willing to be vulnerable and take feedback from people who say, hey, boss, that was really screwed up what you did. You flew off at the handle, and what we needed at the time was calm leadership. And I'm telling you that because I owe it to you as a loyal subordinate who wants this to be the best organization, the best unit, the best led entity, the best led business unit. So I'm telling you honestly, so if people have the courage to tell you as a leader, then you ought to have the courage to listen and do something with it. And trust me, that's not easy. That takes practice. It takes maturity to be able to do that. Your first inclination is likely to be about yourself. Hey, wait a minute. You can't tell me that. I'm the boss.
Right.
You're supposed to be learning from me. I don't learn from you. That would be a good reflection of someone who's not a mature leader.
Right.
But on the other hand, if it's thank you for that, I didn't see it that way, but what you described is what I want to be, and apparently is not what I was. And so I'm gonna try better. I'll be better today and tomorrow than I was a few minutes ago before you had to tell me that.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is the key that unlocks the door to learning about oneself as a leader. You have to accept vulnerability. That takes practice. It takes practice over time. I remember one of my staff officers who happened to be a chaplain said to me, I was probably a 1-star, 2-star at that age, and he says, hey, you need to make yourself more vulnerable. People are intimidated by you. I'm trying to be as open and friendly and approachable as possible. What is it they're intimidated about? They're intimidated about your intellect. Well, God gave it to me. I'm supposed to use it. But it was how it was being manifested. And so after, a few seconds of feeling the bruise as it's delivered, you then become grateful for that feedback. And I've tried to be more and more thoughtful about that. And I've been through some programs, as you and I talked about before, that helped me to see that even more effectively.
Yeah. As you go through those sort of things, to help identify or help move toward servant leadership, the word that kept coming to my mind that I think fits the idea of serving those that are behind you, that don't take yourself too seriously, be vulnerable, is humility. Like this idea of humility, and it seems to me that societally there is this, I want to say lie, I don't know if that's true, but this tendency to say that, well, you have to pretend like you're infallible, otherwise people won't believe in you or whatever. And actually it turns out that if you look at the research in this sort of area, it's when we demonstrate ourselves to be fallible, when we are humble, that creates trust. People see us as authentic and believe that they can trust us and follow us. And that gives us the relationship to then influence them, which is leadership in a nutshell, right? Is the ability to influence others to achieve a common goal. And so that there's this lie that you have to be perfect, when in fact that degrades your ability to lead people in a real way toward positive things. And it isn't, if you, as Dan Allender there's a book out called Leading with a Limp. And so he talks about that, the value of weakness or fallibility with regard to being a better leader. And so I think part of that is humility, that you're getting at, to be able to say, okay, I screwed that up. How can I learn from it? This growth mindset, that you kind of allude to, that Carol Dweck has written a lot about, that I think is vitally important for those of us who historically very high achievers and things of that nature. We have a tendency to have what's called a fixed mindset. And so we think that if we don't accomplish, it's because we have failed, something intrinsic in us. But if we have a growth mindset, we say, well, I screwed that up, but I can learn from it and I get better. Then we grow and we become better. And so anyway, that humility, that's vital to great leadership, I think. So
I 100% agree with you. Right now I hold an endowed chair at West Point under the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, as it's called the Class of 1951 Chair for the Study of Leadership.
Mhm.
And so I spend a lot of time talking about leadership and examining leadership, but I believe that humility is a essential tenet of good leadership. And so you have to be humble about yourself, but you have to also be humble to realize that you have been given a privilege to lead others,
sure.
and even greater privilege to be followed by others. And so that requires some humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hubris doesn't always work. Sometimes you need to use some hubris to inspire. So I had one boss in my early part of my career who said, sometimes being a commander, part of being a commander is being an actor. And I went, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to be my authentic self here. And the point he was making is you have to rise to the occasion that's needed. If you're afraid, but you must demonstrate courage, then demonstrate courage. So there's a degree of utility in hubris sometimes.
Sure.
When inspiration is what you're trying to create among those who are led. But it ought to always be driven by the essence of humility, the humility that you don't know everything.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have all the answers. You do sometimes get things wrong. Your team will help you if you let them. You have much to listen and learn from if you are open to doing so. These are the things that I think make the leaders that we all really admire. That's what makes them most admirable.
Sure. As you were just mentioning that about sometimes you have to be an actor of sorts. I was just thinking about General Patton. So much of his presentation, I think, at least in my readings about him, was generated, was for that very purpose, to inspire people, to induce in them courage and belief that they could do it, whereas he wasn't necessarily what he led on to be.
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and there are many of them. Certainly the World War II generals and admirals are well studied and are worthy of lots of study and emulation. But this idea of also sharing hardship.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to do that, when does your bravado show up? When does the glossiness matter the most? If it's when others are grimy and you're in and out, then your glossiness will be detested.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's you arrive glossy and people see your stars right away, and then you humble yourself, and I used to talk about getting up in the cowl of a helicopter with a repairman, just get up in the cowl. Yeah, you might get some oil on. You'll be all right.
Mm-hmm.
This youngster's got oil all over him or herself. Get underneath of the vehicle, lay in the dirt. Be there when the bullets are flying and the rockets are coming in. Be there when there's risk that needs to be taken. Then your apparent difference, your glossiness, if you will, can have a very different value.
Mm-hmm.
So being at a crossroad, directing people to keep them getting lost is one example of Patton being present.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, he had aides de camp who were killed right beside him. So he was not without exposure to danger. And his time came eventually in a way that would have been unimaginable for the warrior that he was. Douglas MacArthur, the same thing. I mean, and people study different leaders and come up with different conclusions about them. But I use both of those as examples of being present where it matters the most.
Mm-hmm.
There's an old adage that I learned as a junior officer about a story of a British Army sergeant major and being in front of or with his troops.
One of them had the courage to sound off to the sergeant major and said, "Sergeant Major, where are the bloody officers?" The sergeant major, being a wise and experienced soldier, says, "Don't worry, lad. When it's time to die, they'll be here." And so the idea is that the most senior leaders have to be present when the time of danger is the greatest and when the circumstances matter the most. And that's what they exist for. In the meantime, others will be leading at different levels.
Yeah. Yeah. That's servant leadership in the highest caliber, I think. To be there when death and danger are imminent. Well, General Brooks, as I had anticipated, it's been exceptional to get to speak with you again. Thanks for being on the Science of Leadership with us and sharing some of your insights. My hope is maybe down the road I can get you back on, just because every time I talk to you, I learn something and I'm deeply inspired. So thank you, sir, for that.
Well, thank you so much. Again, it's a fantastic piece of work that you did. It's remarkable to have 51 four-star level leaders of our military, past and present, who have shared their insights. Many of them I learned from and served with. And so I really commend you and applaud you for the work that you've done.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.